Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to a brand new video on the channel. Inside of today's video, I'm going to give you guys a guide on the newest mythic support brawler, Glowbert. So Glowbert is really unique and really fun once you learn how to play him. I think when you're playing with randoms, he can be pretty bad, but when you're playing in a team and again, you just learn how to play him, he'll be really powerful. So let's jump into the basics then with Glowbert. So Glowbert has 7,800 health, which is very similar to Poco, but the difference to Poco is that he has much greater range and he also has a fast movement speed. His damage is 1,100 per second and he heals 900 per second, but it's quite hard to just know everything about it because it's a lot of like damage and heal ticks per second. So yeah, it can ramp up pretty fast as well with his gadget, which we'll go on to later on. He's got a healing trait as well, so he'll be getting supercharged through healing his teammates or even healing himself with his second star power. So he can gain a lot of supercharge through that. His super as well is pretty cool. It's not anything crazy, but it will defend himself against assassins and aggro brawlers. Seeing as he's a support brawler, normally they are vulnerable to those types of brawlers. So what it will do is it will push out a large wave and it will actually scare those brawlers because bro is so ugly, and it will lead them to have like a new feared mechanic. So this will only work if they're literally facing you, but then it will kind of hypnotize them. It will push them away for 2 seconds. It will also slow them as well, dealing 1,500 damage. So it's pretty decent. So his supercharge overall as well is 3.5 per hit. So every time you first leech onto a brawler, it's 3.5%. If you're purely dealing damage, it takes 14 seconds to fully build up your super, but you know, if you're healing your teammate as well, that's probably going to half in that duration, so it could be 7 seconds. If you're also got the second star power, you're going to be gaining super even quicker. If you got a second gadget, even quicker. So don't be alarmed by that really long supercharge rate. And then I forgot to mention as well, his range in terms of his main attack is 8 tiles. This is just a bit longer than Squeak's and shorter than Jesse's main attack, so you can kind of bear with it there. So he's not, well, he's probably going to get outranged a little bit in most fights, but he's going to be able to outrange so many different brawlers in the game, like tanks, assassins, whatever else. Now let's run through his gadgets. So gadget number 1 is called Slippery Savior. So with this gadget, you dash and you heal you and your teammates for 2,500 in an area upon arrival, and with a 17-second cooldown. So this is actually a pretty strong gadget because with this gadget you get 25% supercharge with every person you heal. So technically, if you're healing you and both your teammates, you're going to be charging 75% of your super. His super isn't anything crazy, but it will help him defend himself a lot more frequently against his normal counters. So I really like this gadget for a couple of reasons. Moving on to gadget number 2, it is more lumens, and this is my favorite one out of the two because not only does it have a 13-second cooldown, it doubles the damage / healing rate for 2.5 seconds. So you can absolutely beam people, or you can just provide overwhelming healing, which the enemies just can't deal enough damage to kill a brawler. So for example, I love using this gadget. If my teammate's about to walk the ball in Unbreakable, I can pop this gadget and there's just no way they can even kill my teammates. So much healing, so much damage. It's beautiful. So now moving on to the star power, starting off with star power number 1 called Biotic Ecosystem. So with this star power, you can reduce the enemy's damage by 20% and boost your teammates' damage by 20%. Of course, you have to be linked to both of them, but this can really swing a fight heavily in your teammates' favor. But the big catch is it's pretty difficult to always be connected to 2 people, and especially say if both players are just literally engaging in that fight for the first time. Sometimes you might just be constantly reconnecting to your teammates. So yeah, it's a little bit of an awkward star power. It can work, but it's harder to see the value and also just to get the value. Star power number 2 is called Parasitism. So with this star power, it heals you 50% of the damage dealt, which I absolutely love this star power. This star power is the reason why I feel like Glowbert is so strong, for the reason like you're literally dealing damage to the enemies and you're healing up. So again, you can just swing the fight into your favor because you're just healing up whilst they're not, essentially, and they're just getting absolutely shredded. And then you pair this with a second gadget, you're just going to be healing so much. I absolutely love it. and with his star power as well, you're also gaining supercharge through the healing trait. So there's so many benefits to the second star power. So going through his best build overall then, I think both gadgets are actually really useful. I still prefer more lumens way more just because it boosts the damage and healing, and it's a 13-second cooldown. And it really helps you because with Glowbert, you're a support brawler. You're going to be lacking the DPS, but often you can find yourself winning gunfights with this second gadget. But if you're just purely trying to be a supportive teammate, then Slippery Savior can be really good, and it really helps his supercharge rate. So both gadgets I think are very effective. First star power, I'm yet to see the true value. I feel like it maybe could be underrated. I don't know. I've not seen enough of it just yet. But with the second star power, you're just always seeing the value, and you're literally gaining even more value out of the healing trait that you have on top of this as well. So yeah, I think that definitely second gadget and second star power are going to be his best build overall. And then with his gears, I feel like you don't really gain too much benefit out of many gears with Glowbert. So I know he's pretty tanky anyway, but just shield. You're a support brawler, you always want to be shielded up, and then damage as well, because you could be getting more healing once that damage gear is popped. Health gear doesn't really make too much sense with him because you can just gain healing through the second star power, and you can also heal up with a Glowbert whilst you're already linked up to your teammate. So yeah, you're always going to find yourself healing pretty easily, so just go with damage and shield gear. So now let's run through his best and worst game modes overall then. So his 3 best game modes are going to be Gem Grab, Hot Zone, and Knockout. So with Gem Grab, I think most maps are going to be really beneficial for him. He can play as a mid or a lane, but most of the time you want to be playing as a mid. The more open the Gem Grab map, the better, and that's, you want to try and avoid maps with a lot of walls as well. Harder Up Mine has a lot of walls, but it's still really open in the middle, so it can be pretty effective there. Hot Zone, again, the more open the map, the better. I imagine him being the best on maps like Dueling Beetles and Ring of Fire in particular. Definitely Ring of Fire is so open, and all of the action happens in the middle. And then I think Knockout is going to be a really strong game mode for him. I haven't tested him out enough, but at the same time, Knockout is very, very passive, so you can just essentially sit behind your teammates the entire time. Imagine Glowbert with a Frank or a Buster. It's going to be very toxic. So now moving on to his worst game modes, I've gone with Brawl and Heist. Brawl in particular because the meta is very aggressive and there's a lot of maps with a lot of walls. But it can still work in Brawl if you pair him with like a wall breaker or something. But Brawl trying to avoid, just because as well his supercharge rate can be on the slower side most of the time, so he can't defend himself as much as you probably want. And there's a lot of Mortis inside of Brawl. And then Heist. Heist, it's actually not as bad as I thought, because there's a few situations where he can be a good in-between brawler. You always need that in-between brawler that can like clear up the mess. So he can be useful on like Bridge Too Far or Kaboom Canyon if you're pairing him with like an aggressive brawler. I don't think he's like completely unusable in Heist, but there's definitely better options. So now moving on to his best and worst matchups. The best matchups overall for Glowbert are going to be brawlers that don't pierce and have low DPS, or typically the ones that he just out heals, or he can just simply outrange them. So sometimes, you know, like tanks and assassins can actually be good for Glowbert because he can easily just latch onto them and shred them at a distance. But as I said, like Stu, Meeple, these low DPS brawlers just won't be able to. Just think of like other support brawlers like Byron, Poco. They'd like to run it down against those low DPS compositions, and the same goes for Glowbert as well. So now moving on to the worst matchups for Glowbert. So there's a couple of weaknesses with Glowbert. It's that he might not have the quickest burst damage, so if anyone can get on top of him quickly, they can deal with him somewhat. So you know, brawlers like Kenji can be very annoying. I mean, there are instances where you can definitely kill Kenji, but a clever Kenji on the right map will just be a nuisance for Glowbert, of course, because he's lacking the damage. Bell is going to be one of the best counters to Glowbert. So again, think of like Jean, Byron on like Knockout. Most of the time you just pick Bell against those because it stops them grouping up and actually getting a lot of value out of the healing. And the same would definitely go for Glowbert. You know, brawlers like even like Jesse can also stop Glowbert from grouping up. You've got Crow as well because of his anti-heal. You've got throwers, but I don't think throwers are going to be like a massive problem for Glowbert because you can just switch over to the other gadget and you can dash and get on top of them. But like I said, he can actually win a lot of different matchups as well through his second gadget. but most of the time, like Bell and Assassins are going to be your best bet. And then finally, I wanted to maybe bring a new section in here and talk about synergies, because I think it's very important for a support brawler to know their synergies, because that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be supporting your teammates, and you need to know the right brawlers. So first off, you want to synergize with tanks. That literally is obvious, right? You've got one of the most powerful healing abilities with Glowbert. You're literally an Inferno Tower on your teammate. So the tankier the brawler, more value you're going to get. The more healing you're going to provide, the more supercharge you're going to provide through that. Yeah, tanks no brainer. Assassins is next. So again, any brawler that's going to go in quite often and need the healing, well, Glowbert is really good at providing those pocket heals. And then lastly, which is probably the best synergy in my opinion, is a wall breaker. So if you compare like two of these together, it's not, I don't think there's any assassins that can break open walls, but definitely are some tanks that can break open walls, like Brawl, like Frank in particular. If they break open the map, it means that Glowbert is hardly ever going to break his connection onto his teammates and the enemies. So if the map is wide open, it's beautiful. So yeah, I think Frank has to be the best matchup, well, best synergy with Glowbert. So now let's move on to the casual tips. Casual tip number 1. It actually seems hilarious because it's such pitiful damage, but just reconnecting your beam onto an enemy will deal 560 damage at point. The reason why I say this is because I believe the damage is like 220 per tick. It's not per second, per tick. But if you're constantly, say if a Mortis or a Kenji is running you down, you can constantly reconnect this beam and deal that 560 damage. That is going to help you out in a 1 versus 1. It might not seem like a lot, but just quickly, even just reconnecting that beam 3 times, that's 1,500 plus damage. So yeah, very easy and simple tip, but I've seen a lot of Glowberts not reconnect their beam and get that additional damage. So he needs all the help he can get in the damage department. So just reconnect your beam as frequently as possible. Don't be afraid to spam. Casual tip number 2 is to know that you can gain supercharge through 3 different avenues. You might have heard me talk about this already, but let's go through it. So of course, you're going to be gaining super through damage dealt, which as a support brawler, you want to try and lean away from that as much as possible. Really, you want to be actually healing your teammates, but it's still pretty good, and you can do both things at once, right? Healing and damaging. Healing whilst damaging enemies through your 2nd star power, you'll be gaining that supercharge. So yeah, literally just from that alone, you just dealing damage is going to allow you to heal. That's 2 ways of getting supercharge, and then just healing your teammates. So that's why that really high supercharge rate isn't as alarming as you'd think, because if you're on a 2nd star power, you're just going to get supercharged from everywhere. Casual tip number 3 is to know that your beam can disconnect quite easily if your teammate or the enemy is too far away from you. So always trying to manage that, right? So making sure that you're in distance, at least within your teammate. That's probably the easiest way to keep your beam connected. And if a wall is in between your beams. So that's again going to be a very frequent one. The reason why I say this is because you've always got to bear that in mind when you're positioned, and always having it in the back of your head, because again, like the way that you play Glowbert is all about your positioning. So making sure that you're in the most open area possible, so you get the most benefit out of your main attack. Casual tip number 4 is kind of a tip to counter Glowbert, but always to make sure that you're not wasting your super. So with your super, you can only scare the enemy if they are looking directly at you. So if they're facing towards you, so if a Mortis dashes into you, then you can use the super to scare them away. But if, for whatever reason, say if a bull comes in aggro on you and then, just turns around because he doesn't want to face your super, then you're not actually going to scare them. So then they could turn around again and just take you down with ease. So you've got to be timing your super correctly. I think the lower you are in ranks, people aren't going to realize this, but at high level gameplay, this definitely can be a factor and can definitely get you killed, because Glowbert is very weak up close. So now moving on to the pro tips. It's hard to come up with some absolutely insane tips, because with Glowbert, it's very simple. You connect onto a teammate or an enemy, and it's just infinitely dealing damage. You don't even have to re-aim, so it's one of the least skillful attacks, if that makes sense. But there is skill in learning your positioning and knowing when to go in and when to not as a healer. So the first one is one rule you've got to always abide by. This is the one reason you would pick a Glowbert, and you've just got to always think of this as the way to play him, is to pocket heal. So like the definition of a pocket heal, say for example you've got just any type of tank, Frank, anything in front of you, you're directly behind. Well, it doesn't have to be directly behind it, but you know what I mean. You're always behind them, to the side of them, and they're the ones that are going to be soaking up all the damage and taking the attention, but you're providing some really good heals. So this is a lot more prevalent in other esports, especially like Overwatch, where you'll send in your tank and you literally have a healer just constantly healing them up. But sometimes if you're a really good pocket healer, you'll just be healing way more than the enemies can put out damage, and that will just gain you map control. A lot of it is just about gaining control of the map, pushing them all the way back to spawn, and that's just essential in winning so many different games inside of Brawl Stars. So yeah, mainly look to heal and push up with your teammates. This might not always be possible if you're playing randoms and you just got a random composition, but if you're in ranked or you're playing with a team, making sure that you've got one brawler in your team that can benefit a lot out of a pocket heal. Pro tip number 2 is, I don't know whether it's a bug or it's actually an intended mechanic, but it's just useful to know, is that you can actually heal up from pets, the high safe, turrets, etc. So I quickly learned this just through shooting like a Jesse turret. Same goes for like 8-bit turret, like a Nita bear chasing you down. And in particular in Heist, it was actually pretty powerful in Heist. Say, for whatever reason, I just can't land my shots onto the enemy when I'm close to the Heist safe. You probably don't want to be near the Heist safe much as Glowbert, but you can just connect onto the Heist safe, and especially with the second star power, you can heal, and some enemies might not have the damage to even kill you if that healing is that big, especially with the second gadget on top of that. So it's just useful to know as well. You can also use your super against spawnables, which might not be the most useful information, but you could use it against like a Tickhead and like a Bruce Bear if you're really lacking the damage. But yeah, it's quite useful to know that you can heal from these things. Pro tip number 3 is all about map awareness. So it's making sure that you always move with the enemy, or at the same time move with your teammates. So you're kind of juggling the two together and always weighing up your options. But for the most part, it's pretty easy to stay connected with a teammate, right? Because if you're pushing up the map, a lot of the time you don't even notice that you're just providing the healings for your teammates. But you can be very, very toxic with your beams onto the enemies as well. So with Glowbert, he literally beams people, and it's a constant flow of damage. So the only way they can disconnect this is by running behind a wall or moving really far away. But if they're moving really far away, most of the time it's because they're pushing all the way further back to their spawn. So you're gaining more map control by doing this. So by constantly keeping that beam attached, by pushing even further into them, you're just literally getting so much map control. It's insane. That's why I really love Glowbert, but they're often forced to retreat because of your main attack beam. So yeah, again, map control. But also they might be forced to push into you, which with your super you can defend yourself, but normally you have a teammate close by if you're playing Glowbert correctly. So by what I mean, it just always got to be using your main attack in the most toxic way possible. Who doesn't want to get beamed by a constant stream of damage? It's quite insane what you can do with Glowbert. So the final pro tip is, again, like nothing crazy, but one thing I've been noticing, and especially when I first picked up Glowbert, I thought that Glowbert was going to be a pretty low damage dealer and tanks and assassins would run all over him. But I'm very surprised, especially with the second gadget, how much damage you can deal. Sometimes, if a Ems is up close or a Mortis or a Kenji, I can often win that 1 versus 1, trust me. So don't be afraid to engage in a 1 versus 1 fight with these types of brawlers. You can win second star power, second gadget. You can just absolutely shred them. And it's actually hilarious how many fights you can win with this brawler. He's a support brawler at the end of the day. You'd think he'd be as weak as like Poco in terms of 1 versus 1 fights, but he's actually really strong with that particular build. So just bear that in mind. Once you learn your capabilities with this brawler, you'll realize that he doesn't have as many weaknesses as you probably first thought. I don't know if that's because I see him as an S tier brawler or that's just how he's always going to be, even if he was nerfed. But I just think that's just the power of Glowbert. So that's going to be it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Whether you have any tips you want to put down in the comment section below if I've missed out on any. But overall with Glowbert, it's all about position, all about trying to get as much value, always being connected to 2 people at once to gain as much supercharge as possible, as much healing, as much damage. Just always stay connected, guys. Glowbert is a lot stronger than you think.